In the immortalized words of a great scientist, life finds a way. Except this time we aren't talking about dinosaurs figuring out how to overcome an enzyme, which might actually be a cool episode to discuss later. No, this time we were talking about why it's never a good idea to let your guard down around an alien form of life that you have no idea how it will react to your poking and prodding. In the not too distant future, before Ryan Reynolds had become Deadpool, humans had successfully funded a mission to Mars. This mission discovered something while out there and brought back a sample. Understanding that they couldn't just have the sample on Earth in case it was hostile to human life, they decided the best recourse would be to have it far above the planet, in the space station, while the life was examined. A good call to be sure, but the issue arose when the creature was subjected to an environmental shock, and then humans were forced to provide another shock to wake it back up, something that would make us seem hostile in the creature's eyes. So in today's episode, we will be talking about Calvin from the movie Life, which was supposed to be an awesome space horror movie, but it just was sort of DOA, I guess you could say. Alright, so let's get to it. So for all new people here, if you look on your screen or even just at my action bars or whatever in God's name they're called, chapters I think someone said, you'll find that I do indeed do summaries of these movies. One of the things that I've kind of seen is that sometimes people will just straight up talk about movies, and if I've never seen them, then I really have to just sort of deduce the plot from context clues. So to avoid that, I just summarize the whole thing. Apparently this can be quite a shock to some people, so if it's shocking, and I'm kind of mentioning that a lot, you can jump ahead to the science portion of why Calvin is going to suck the meat out of your insides. For everyone else, let's get to why you should never poke an alien with a cattle prod, shall we? We start up our story with a capsule floating through space. On its return trip to Earth, it naturally flies into some sort of space rocks, which then send it on the still kind of same generalized trajectory, but it causes it to ever so slightly go off course. Had it gone off course and missed us, it really would have been good for at least another decade or so, or at least humanity would have. The International Space Station is well aware of what happened and is reporting to Mission Control. As they attempt to figure out what to do, they suit up Rory, who will be sent out to operate what can amount to $1 billion catcher's mitt. As the crew watches on, Rory gets ready to catch the capsule. They correct their heading and then wait. I mean, I know honestly that they wanted to get this thing, but they sort of put themselves into the path of this, flying thousands of kilometers per hour, so if he misses, they're pretty much screwed. All that said, they do end up catching the capsule and then celebrating as they've officially doomed themselves. The next day, an exobiologist, really I think they should be called xenobiologist, Hugh Derry, which is, you know, whether it's exo or xeno, that's an absolute goal level of biology, at least for me, examines the samples to find evidence of a single cell life, except it's fairly different from the life on Earth, but in some ways it's still similar. It's similar in the aspect that it's carbon-based, needs air, food, and water, but the cell wall is thick, much thicker than anything on Earth, including plants, and it will later behave much like an animal cell might in some ways, but it really appears to be like an ultra-capable protozoa. It has quite a few of what Hugh deduces to be cilia, although from that length, I would go on a branch here to say that it's a pseudopodia based on overall size, but we will also get to that later. Apart from that, the cytoplasm, nucleus, membrane, and all the hallmark traits of an Earth-based organism are there, but due to its clear morphological differences, it's pretty apparent that this is not a cross-contamination issue from Earth, which has happened in the past, so also stick around because I have a conspiracy theory about the phosphine gas on Venus that we may have detected, which could be an indicator of life in the upper atmosphere of that planet. And this is like real life, so it's pretty interesting. Anyways, as Hugh gives it water, raises the temperature, and surrounds it with glucose, as well as altering the local atmosphere, eventually he is able to awaken the single-celled life and bring it out of its hibernation. Obviously, everyone is pretty jazzed about it. Back on Earth, kids are asking the scientists the usual questions via Skype, because nobody could have predicted the rise of Zoom a few years later. So anyhow, you get a lot of questions about the bathroom, for some reason, with the International Space Station, which, if y'all want to know how ridiculous humanity is, this is just completely off topic, but then again, those are my type of videos. There's an anecdotal story that a spacesuit really has a sleeve, we'll call it, and it's supposed to secure a certain part of the male anatomy on spacewalks, so if you need to go, you can go. Well, the sizes were small, medium, and large. Well, males would continually choose the large option and wouldn't fit properly. So they had to change the sizing to large, huge, and gigantic so people would actually pick the proper fitment. As it turns out, you can take the human off the planet, but you can't take the ego out of the human. Again, anecdotal, but I always think about that because it seems as no matter how far we advance, humans will always be ridiculous. But back on track in New York, apparently a contest was held and one school was chosen to pick the name for the alien, and his name is Calvin. With a name like that, it's no surprise that he turned on humanity so quickly. Shout out to all my Calvins currently watching. So from here, we start getting into some interpersonal stuff with the crew, not important, but the doctor, or as he's known, David Jordan, is about to break a record for being in space the longest at over 400 days, which, if y'all didn't know, the shielding on the International Space Station isn't foolproof. Astronauts that have been up there for a really long time say that they will see random flashes of light, and it's actually ionized particles smashing through their body, creating tiny holes in their retina, which activates the light-sensing cells. Pretty wild. But the radiation you get up there is low, but it can still accumulate damage to your meat suit. The atrophy within David's muscles has also become quite an issue. David says that the reason he's up there for so long after being in the military, he likes it because he doesn't want to go where humanity is, because we just continually screw one another up, which is not incorrect. The next day, as Hugh continues to work with Calvin, he finds that it's actually becoming a multicellular organism, but strangely it's different from how life works here. Multicellular organisms here specialize when working together, at least with animals. Muscle cells, nerve cells, photosensitive cells, bone cells, immune cells, stomach cells, whichever. While the DNA within them remains the same, depending on which genes are activated, causing them to specialize in certain ways to support the body as a whole. The other end of this is the single cell organism, doing this on its own, but typically it can't coordinate with other cells all that well. Calvin, on the other hand, is what is known as a supercell. Now, it's kind of a colloquialism because if you look up supercell, the only thing you're going to get is weather terms, because as far as I know, there are no supercells on Earth. Actually, there are no supercells on Earth. It's not a natural part of evolution on this planet, but essentially a supercell is more capable than a regular cell. In Calvin's case, every cell is a muscle cell, a nerve cell, a photosensitive cell, providing sight, the ability to break things down. If it's a stomach cell, it's just everything. Every cell is capable on its own and more capable in a group. Its abilities later to break down other cells makes it a near perfect predator. Every cell is capable of doing the job of the cell next to it, and because of that, its intelligence grows quickly, as does its strength and capability. Calvin at this point can also interact with its environment. It has formed proto-appendages and then reaches out to Hugh as he reaches for it. The creature is curious about Hugh, to which he's also curious about it. At the beginning, Calvin is not aggressive as long as what it's interacting with is not aggressive either. Also not important, but Sho just had a kid. I'm sure that means nothing terrible will happen to him. Later that day, Hugh continues working with Calvin, and at this point, Calvin is crawling on his glove as the mass of cells is becoming more and more capable. Later that night, an alarm goes off as Rory goes in to fix an issue with a clamp. Hugh forgot to close it earlier, and because of that, the crew is pretty upset. Miranda brings up that they don't know what these cells are. For all they know, they could just be carrying a form of like space anthrax. Hugh gets defensive, saying that Calvin is an anthrax, to which Rory brings him back to reality. Those cells in there could be dangerous. They don't know, but if Hugh doesn't make sure everything is sealed up properly, he's putting everyone in danger. He reminds Hugh that that thing isn't his buddy. Because of the clamp failure, the air pressure changed, which caused Calvin to actually go into a hibernation. But this actually relieves Miranda to a certain degree because the creature was growing extremely quickly with the nutrition that they were giving it. But because of this, Hugh decides that he needs to shock it back to, I guess, life. He goes on about how this could replace stem cells, cure the incurable, so obviously he's a little too close to this given his paralysis. And I'm not sure what he's basing this assumption on, if I'm being honest, because they know absolutely nothing about this cell. That would be like finding bacteria and being like, it could cure stem cell issues. Based on what? As Hugh begins shocking Calvin, at first it doesn't work, but as he raises the level, it jumps back to life and onto his glove. It breaks the wand and then grips his hand. As Hugh tries to pull his hand back, it begins breaking his fingers. Eventually, this causes him to pass out. While he floats there, Calvin begins testing the glove durability. Realizing that it can't get out that way if it doesn't have a sharp instrument, it goes back for the wand, breaks it in half, and then uses the sharp point to escape the glove and into the open environment. Yeah, at that point, no way, man. Keep that sealed tight entirely. Eventually, Calvin finds that the rodent is tied down. It mimics it for a moment, but as the mouse goes to bite at Calvin, Calvin then attacks it. Within seconds, it breaks the mouse down for all its cells and then grows considerably in size. Rory jumps in and grabs Hugh, basically trading places as Calvin attaches to Rory's leg, to which then Rory grabs an oxygen candle and burns it off. He asks for permission to body the creature and then grabs an incinerator and goes after it. While he's attempting to burn it, it's not so much that he's missing it every time, the creature is just highly resistant to fire, likely due to the cell walls every single cell has on the outer layer, which kind of forms a sacrificial barrier. Honestly, at this point, it would have been perfect for Rory to just escape, but he doesn't. Instead, the creature jumps on him, goes inside his mouth, and considering what we just saw it do to that mouse and the amount of blood, it can be assumed that that's what it's doing to his insides, quickly converting the brainstem, brain, lungs, and ultimately heart as it moves down, and this flatlines Rory pretty quickly. As Rory floats there, the incinerator is out of fuel, but still has enough to keep the flame going. As it triggers the fire suppression system, it makes the room no longer sealed. The creature exits exits Rory's mouth and begins going after the fire suppression system, eventually getting inside one of the openings before it can close and escaping into the main station. With the quarantine compromised, it's now free to move about and begin its hunt. As Kat sends a distress call back to Earth, her transmission is cut off, to which they have no idea how much actually got through, and that'll be important later. Losing contact with Earth, they still have a local ability to communicate. They need to exit the station and fix the comms, so they send Kat, as she's the only one qualified at this point. As she checks on the transmitter outside, she finds that it has overheated and there appears to be scorch marks on it. They arrive at the conclusion that Calvin must have destroyed the transmitter so they couldn't call for help. Now, how did a mass of cells arrive at this conclusion? Well, we will discuss that later. As they question whether Calvin intentionally went after the water-cooled comms and CPU, Calvin then exits and attaches to Kat. As she crawls along, it turns out that Calvin has broken the coolant line on her suit. Calvin officially knows a ton about spacesuits. As she moves inside, her helmet begins filling with the coolant, which is poisonous, so she can't just drink it. So now she's basically drowning. As they get to the airlock and get it ready, David goes in to get her, but as he's trying to tell her how to open the valve, Kat realizes that the jig is up at this point because that's really what Calvin wants. She prefers to drown herself and turns the lever the wrong way and chooses to keep Calvin outside of the ship to save the rest of the crew, but that's not how things are going to go down. As the crew begins discussing is there any other way that Calvin can get in, the thrusters are possibly a way in. Sho then watches the temp gauges as Calvin continues to try to get in them. They try to blast him into space, but after operating the thrusters a few times, in space, that causes some problems as they quickly run out of enough fuel to keep that up, and if they burn any more, they won't be able to fix their decaying orbit from them just doing that. So they decide that they need to let the creature into the ship to stop it from getting to Earth. Hugh comes up with an idea that they just need to purge all life support on the ship because that might send Calvin into his hibernation once again. As they do this, Calvin is stalking them actually around the ship. Meanwhile, Hughes is actually looking a little out of it. As they get the International Space Station back up to where it needs to be, Hughes' situation continues to randomly devolve as the crew discusses what they've seen. Hugh has a revelation that Calvin doesn't hate them, but he has to end them in order to survive. As Hugh passes out and then flatlines, they start trying to get his heart to beat again, which doesn't work at first. As they continue to shock him, they get him back and see that something is moving on his pant leg. They pull back his lower pant leg to find that Calvin has been feeding on his blood because he's paralyzed and didn't feel it. At this point, they defib Calvin, who has gotten to the point where he can now flap portions of his body to move through the ship more easily. As the crew members bolt, Sho jumps into his sleeping pod as Calvin tries to find a way in. It attempts to break the glass and it actually seems like it's quite capable of doing so, but then leaves him instead. They talk to Hugh with his last few minutes that he has left as his blood oxygen levels have dropped dangerously low due to the low amount of blood he has, to which he flatlines again fairly quickly. As Miranda and David discuss the hate that they have for Calvin, which I'm not sure why this is such a revelation, they realize that they can actually track Calvin because it ate a tracker from Hugh's legs. Moving over the ship, it ends up following a blood trail back to Hugh as it begins consuming him to become larger before attempting to break back into the crew areas. However, they seal it in and then trap it, but a proximity alarm has begun blaring. Coming up from Earth, a ship attaches to the hull of the International Space Station. Despite them trying to hail it and make it turn away, it begins pushing the ISS. Miranda says it was a protocol that if Calvin turned hostile, the ship would be pushed into deep space rather than let it crash back down to Earth. It was basically a safety protocol to kind of yeet that thing out of our orbit. Sho at this point realizes that he is screwed if he stays in the pod, and he attempts to leave, but ends up opening the area and letting Calvin out. Maximum move. Calvin then grabs him and attempts to pull him back, but for some reason, the rocket attached to the clamps outside malfunctions and breaks a few of the clamps, causing the airlock to rupture. Sho chooses to drop with Calvin in an attempt to take him with him, but alas, Calvin is able to crawl back inside the ship. Because of this failure of the rocket, all that random thrusting and movement, it has caused their orbit to decay once again. They realize that they're going to hit the atmosphere in 30 minutes, so they need to devise a plan. David realizes that they need to send this thing into deep space rather than let it get to Earth. David wants to lure Calvin into a pod, so he sends Miranda into pod B to go back to Earth. David then chooses pod A with Calvin because he has no desire to return back to Earth with humanity, so he will pilot it into deep space. As David moves through, he ends up luring Calvin in with a few candles before getting into his pod, to which Calvin obliges to come with them. At this point, Miranda heads to her pod. David then preps the pod and fires out. Calvin breaks the candle quickly that was distracting him and then goes after David. Miranda fires hers and then heads towards Earth. David begins attempting to pilot his pod towards deep space manually. Miranda radios to Earth to tell them what they are dealing with, but as she does, she hits some space debris. And now this is the unfortunate part. Because of David's long time in space, his muscles are weak. Calvin has really no issue stopping him from reaching the controls easily and then restrains him from piloting the ship to space. Whereas Miranda, considering she just hit space debris, is now flying out into space to meet her unfortunate end of starvation or dehydration. Maybe the air will run out. It's really no way to tell. So basically Basically, that plan went to absolute hell. After David lands in the ocean, he's freed by Vietnamese fishermen despite him telling them not to open the door, which in turn releases Calvin onto the planet. And considering it's hypothesized that Calvin was what caused the extinction on Mars to happen, looks like humanity and all the things here are next up on the chopping block. But hey, I guess that's just life, isn't it? Ha! Every day is pain. So the first thing I think that we should talk about is a supercell, how that cell interacts with other cells, and with Calvin being composed of these type of cells, how does that give him the abilities that he has, which in turn makes him such a formidable foe to scientists and doctors located on the space station. But even before that, what happened to Mars? In our own reality, even as soon as 700 million years ago, which seems like a lot, but cosmologically speaking, we literally just missed it. Venus was a warm, habitable planet with its own oceans as well as Mars. Venus, Earth, and Mars were essentially all ranging in terms of temperature, as you might well imagine, based on proximity to Sun. But as the internals of Venus continued to change and CO2 was spewed out of the volcanoes, the planet quickly became uninhabitable to humans. Not that we were ever really there. Mars, however, may have lasted longer in terms of habitability, but due to its lack of magnetic field, the planet was bombarded with solar radiation and had its atmosphere stripped away. However, in the movie Life, once upon a time it would appear that there was in fact life on Mars. With the arrival of Calvin, this planet was quickly overrun and all life was destroyed. The reasoning for why Calvin is not native to the planet is with a species that aggressive and capable, nothing else would have a chance to evolve on that planet, and instead everything would be consumed, leaving only Calvin, which is what is hinted at as having happened. If that were not the case, other microorganisms would have been found in the crust of the planet where they were digging, but instead they only found one form of life. After Calvin left the planet barren, time passed and the atmosphere was ripped away. This introduction of solar radiation, changes in the atmosphere pressure and composition, triggered Calvin's hibernation reflexes. This also hints that Calvin not being a native at Mars due to the fact that he can survive extremely hostile environments. Likely this creature originates from some other area of the galaxy, or it's quite possible this creature may have originated anywhere depending on how long it can survive in space, which we have seen is quite a long time. So the question is, how feasible is it for Calvin to survive for this long, and how might he do it? Well, again, it's hypothesized, at least with Mars, within the last several hundred million years, it became a barren wasteland. Because of this, that would put Calvin's single cell at hundreds of millions of years old. And to do this, that would mean it needs to enter a state that we actually find bacteria doing in hostile environments. When bacteria is in a barren area with low nutritional states, improper climate, or really anything that can hinder its growth, certain variants can enter something known as an endospore. The bacteria will form a spore within itself which contains a coat on the outside which is resistant to enzymatic activity and environmental pressures to a degree, as well as an outer membrane, cortex, germ cell wall, and inner membrane. Essentially, this allows the bacteria to exist in a vegetative state using very little energy while it waits for more hospitable environments to form. The original bacterial cell then lyses and releases the spore. Should you be infected with a spore, it can enter its standard bacterial form and then begin an infection. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, it can only last like a few days, right? Well, actually, some endospores have been shown to be viable up to 10,000 years, with some revival of spores claiming to have awoken bacterial cells that are millions of years old. So take this idea on our planet with our standard cells that we have, and you can see that a creature lasting in a dormant state being awoken, more so one that appears to be much more capable as far as cellular activity, and it can actively and logically react to its environment. The idea of Calvin having survived in the soil of Mars becomes much more of a possibility. To put in perspective of how strong Calvin actually might be, we can actually take a look at microorganisms on Earth even further. We know in the past that we have inadvertently thought there was confirmed life on the moon due to a cross-contamination issue with our atmosphere, allowing bacteria from Earth into the vacuum of space. Because of this, it took time, but we quickly realized, based on genetic coding, that this was Earth bacteria. But you know what exists in our upper atmosphere? You guessed it, bacteria, all the way actually into the stratosphere. To which brings me back to my Venus comment that I was going to say earlier. Recently, and take this with a grain of salt because it may have just been a data issue, we might have found phosphine gas in Venus's upper atmosphere, an area of the atmosphere that we know the temperature-wise is actually fairly hospitable, and humanity could literally visit it if we had, like, say, a large balloon and could exist outside without the need for heat shielding. It's roughly about 80 to 97 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, or 27 to 36 degrees Celsius. Still warm, but not going to cook you immediately. At night, it does get colder with temperatures in the negatives, but the key here is it's fairly habitable range for microbes to exist if they are anaerobes. So my conspiracy theory is that when we drop probes on Venus, we may have inadvertently seeded this part of the atmosphere with microbes from Earth that may have been producing phosphine gas. Now again, this all hinges on data that we have collected being read correctly for what we have identified, but it would still be pretty cool nonetheless, or terrible because we literally just accidentally seeded a planet. But the point of this rambling is that the upper atmosphere of Earth, which is inhospitable to life that we know of it down here, or in the deepest points of the ocean where thermal external events exist also keep life going. Life is fairly resilient, and Calvin is more resilient than that. With the introduction of nutrition and a similar Earth-like environment applied to the biological cabinet, this produces the environment for Calvin to wake back up, to which they determined that he's a thicker cell wall than anything seen on Earth. Because of this may actually play into Calvin's longevity after entering a state of suspended animation. The cold slowing down the cellular metabolism, the evolutionary traits doing the same, the likely coating the creature would actually form along with the cell wall and the protection from direct sunlight due to it being within the actual crust of Mars. There's no reason to think that the potential Calvin could have may have made him last indefinitely if it stayed in this state until the planet's destruction with the sun going supernova. Because of this presumed idea, Calvin is space herpes. Likely whatever planet it may have been on once upon a time may have actually had other animals that were capable of resisting such an infection from Calvin, or it may have just been the apex species of said planet. But when whatever alien sun it was orbiting finally exploded, Calvin's species may have been so adapted to hardships on whatever planet it was on, it may have been surviving within the crust itself and then sent into deep space as a chunk of rock, and this might be how it ended up accidentally seeding Mars with an apex predator. As Calvin continued to grow and absorb biomass, there are two questions that need to be answered. The first is, how is Calvin, after exiting in assumed spore form, capable of existing outside, and how did they know he would expire in space? Okay, well, I guess there's actually three questions, because the third question is, how does Calvin actually absorb biomass? To answer the first two, look no further than any cell that is exposed to the environment of space. Think for a moment. If you didn't have any nerves to relay pain, what would you feel in space? Well, with your standard meat suit, if you were to go into the vacuum of space, it would be cold, your eyes would instantly freeze, water in your body would begin boiling, but not because of heat, but really because of lack of pressure, and your lungs would probably burst if you held your breath. Sounds pretty bad, right? Well, despite all this, your body can actually survive in space for up to a minute. Granted, that minute is excruciating, but it's completely possible. Our eukaryotic cells, at least animal cells, lack things like cell walls, and because of this, it really comes down to membranes, which are fairly susceptible to things like environmental influences. Cell walls play a huge role in supportive structuring of a cell, but also in a lot of other aspects. And this can cause a creature composed of cells with cell walls to survive exposure issues that might take an animal out. So I mean, look outside. We call those plants. Plants can't move, at least not very quickly, which means that they have to exist outside in the elements and will either thrive or expire based on what they have going for them. And this is actually why the first biomass on this planet to move up onto land were plants. Even then, it took them a while to develop into strong enough cell forms and then form into plants that we know them today. The fact is, plant cells with cell walls would be considered more resilient than animal cells, at least in some instances, but without the rigidity of the cell wall, animals are capable of movement even down to a single-celled organism like a protozoa. Now take something like Calvin, who has the best of both worlds, movement and a cell wall. This would allow the creature to leave the confines of the space station for a limited amount of times, but much longer than any human would be capable of surviving in space. Also take into account that the fact that this creature appears to have a better control over its individual cell functions, resulting in a more macro utility and things like opening and closing of cell walls, and those could be shut, providing more protection, with the outermost cells providing almost a shield-like covering, which allows the creature to operate for extended periods of time in really hostile environments. So next thing is, what in the name of all that is holy happened to that mouse that Calvin came into contact with? Well, look no further than the movie The Thing for a decent explanation on what's going on. However, you're watching this, so I'll go ahead and provide a decent explanation. As a supercell comes into contact with a regular cell, it's clear that it lyses the internal contents of the regular animal cell quite easily, as we see with the mouse. As the skin is quickly worked through, new skin is then seen underneath with blood vessels, and everything starts turning pink until the muscle is then gotten to, and then the nervous system, and ultimately the skeleton. Each cell of Calvin likely contains enough lysosomes, or it might even just straight break open the cell entirely, utilizing its own cells. Upon this happening, the nutrients of those cells are absorbed, which in turn allows Calvin's cells to undergo mitosis. And if there were a drinking game where you take a shot every time I say cell, nobody would survive. This leads to a larger creature that the more it's able to absorb other biomass, the more it's able to grow, much like anything else. But with all that said, something else is happening when Calvin grows. Since every cell is working together and can function independently as well as its own, as it grows, it gets smarter and stronger, sort of like our brains. The larger they get to a point, the smarter we are. Now, it's a really simplified version because Einstein's brain actually wasn't bigger than the average person's, and in fact, it was a little bit smaller. But regardless, the key here is that as Calvin grows, its intelligence increases, but I would go out on a limb to say something else is happening also. As Calvin goes after and takes out Rory, did you notice how the creature was now capable capable of understanding the systems of the ship, while not directly interacting with them, it knew the water-cooled the transmitters and the CPUs. While not knowing how to interact with them, it knew how to break them and also navigate the ship. You know who else knew that? Rory. Rory was essentially the mechanic of the ship, which means whoever the creature takes out, it would absorb that person, which means after taking out Rory, it definitely knows there are humans on the planet below, which is exactly why it overpowers David and subdues him while it crashes onto the planet. So how might it be doing this? The first thing to understand about our brains is memories are just patterns. They aren't so much stored in our neurons, but in a way of our neurons firing. This is why things like dementia affect our memories, because as things like the pathways are lost, so too is the memory lost. And this is why things like a certain smell can trigger a memory, because whatever smell forged that pathway along with the memory fires along the same route and triggers that memory that you have should you smell that smell again. So with memories being patterns, that means intelligence is a pattern, because intelligence is application of memories in new ways, possibly causing new patterns to emerge, which becomes new technologies or standards. When Calvin interacts with a human, likely it would be quite easily figuring out that our brains were located in our skulls, as a lot of juice is being sent from one area of the body. Moving into the brain of a person, such as with Hugh and Rory, it would quickly pick up these patterns and connections that our brains fired and could replicate those. Now the issue is, let's say like you could absorb somebody else's brain, but you didn't speak the language, you would need something like a Rosetta Stone to translate what our brains know, as well as the human language. But taking into consideration of how smart Calvin would be, likely would be an ongoing process as it moves around the ship, learning from the host's brain, which was absorbed, which again means likely Rory and Hugh at this point just have empty skulls shortly after the lights went out. So this means after Calvin took over a few bodies, he way outclassed normal human intelligence and could outthink and outmaneuver the scientists and doctors, leading them to a quick end. So much so that he began to not even see humans as threats as when he left Sho in his pod. Rather than take him out, Calvin knew that he would come out if he just waited long enough, and he could actually end up using Sho to open the doors so the creature was no longer sealed in. Again, thinking way ahead of humans. So the next question is, how do you overcome this thing? Well, I would have to disagree with Hugh that the creature, despite being carbon-based, could have been destroyed in a vacuum. This creature existed in a quasi-vacuum of Mars for hundreds of millions of years. The only thing I could really see destroying this creature is radiation of space, which is why they found it only in the soil, as it needed to protect itself from the UV radiation, as well as the more damaging forms like gamma radiation. So the issue is, with it now on Earth, there's really not a likely possible scenario that you could stop this thing. The only way humanity could even contain it, maybe, is directed radiation or a scorched Earth policy, literally unleashing massive amounts of radiation over a large area to degrade the Calvin cells and destroy them. The issue is, however, that destroys life as we know it and makes large swaths of land uninhabitable. And this is the best case scenario too. Should Calvin get a foothold, which, let's be honest, it's in the ocean at this point, there's no way to destroy it. And remember, since it's a single-celled organism, that it may be capable of working alone, coupled with a multicellular one, there's no reason to suggest that Calvin couldn't just break off a piece of him and then seed an area with individual cells. The best way to compare Calvin is the flood from Halo 3 landing on Earth in the present time. The shipmaster glassed half a continent for a small outbreak, which is the only option to save the planet. But unfortunately, no genocidal aliens are coming to our rescue on this one, so we would really be just us. Our planet would be destroyed in days as life was wiped out and only Calvin life remained. The atmosphere would then change over time, as well as no oxygen from the ocean or really plant life remaining, and Calvin would enter a state of hibernation, once more waiting for the next species to find it and unleash it on their planet.